Inside a control room on a tropical island off the southern coast of China, engineers are watching over a reactor that has never generated a single watt of electricity. Within the next few months, that is about to change completely. The containment dome is sealed. The pumps are already installed. The steam systems have already passed their pressure tests. Once this one compact unit switches on, it could send enough power into the grid to supply more than 500,000 homes, something close to 1 million people, from a machine small enough to fit comfortably inside a large warehouse. A reactor of this type would normally take Western countries well over a decade to finish from the very first shovel in the ground. Let that number sit for a second, because it deserves a second look. 500,000 homes. Nearly 1 million people. Not from a sprawling nuclear complex with 4 or 6 separate reactor buildings and a decade of delays behind it. From one single unit, roughly the size of a large industrial silo, sitting on Hainan Island. If you are picturing a normal nuclear power plant right now, picture something else entirely. Something closer to a stack of shipping containers than the massive concrete cooling towers most people imagine when they hear the word nuclear. And here is where the story actually gets interesting, because the reactor itself is almost beside the point. This is a story about how China managed to finish one of these before anyone else on Earth could, and why that timeline gap is starting to genuinely worry the countries that used to define the entire nuclear industry. If quiet engineering races like this one are exactly what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe before we get into how this timeline gap actually happened. Because the origin story explains the speed, the price, and the risk all at once. Here is a comparison almost anyone can understand instantly. A traditional nuclear power plant, the kind built across the United States, France, or the United Kingdom, usually takes close to a decade to complete, sometimes 15 years, and routinely runs billions of dollars over its original budget. This specific reactor, called Linglong 1, poured its very first concrete in July of 2021. By the end of 2025, it had already passed every major pre-startup test on the checklist. That is not a normal nuclear construction timeline. That timeline looks a lot closer to how China builds electric vehicle factories, battery plants, and container ships than how the rest of the world builds nuclear reactors. And that detail alone should make you pause. Because if a country can build nuclear reactors on something approaching an electric vehicle factory schedule, that fundamentally changes who ends up controlling the next generation of power grids at exactly the moment every power-hungry industry on the planet is hunting for cheap, reliable, carbon-free electricity. This story did not begin as a secret weapons program or a sudden flash of engineering genius. It began with a problem almost every country fighting climate change while simultaneously feeding an economy hungry for artificial intelligence is currently wrestling with. Nuclear power genuinely works as a technology. Building it, however, has become nearly impossible to finish anywhere on time or on budget. China looked at that exact problem more than a decade ago and decided to solve it the same way it had already solved electric vehicles, batteries, and solar panels. Not through some miraculous single breakthrough, but through a factory. Here is the underlying problem the nuclear industry has quietly wrestled with for almost 20 years now. Nearly everyone agrees nuclear power is one of the only genuinely serious answers to a warming planet paired with exploding electricity demand. Data centers need it. AI training clusters need it. Entire national power grids need something that does not simply disappear the moment the wind stops blowing. But almost nobody on Earth can build a brand new reactor without the project turning into a financial catastrophe somewhere along the way. In the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, projects originally planned to finish inside 6 or 7 years routinely drag past a full decade. with costs ballooning by billions of dollars along the way. And those cost overruns eventually land squarely on ratepayers and taxpayers, not just on the utility executives who signed off on the original budget. The industry's dream solution for years has been the small modular reactor. Compact, built in standardized, factory-sized pieces, trucked to a site and assembled like components rather than poured and welded together over a decade of continuous construction. Smaller, cheaper, faster, and standardized across every unit built. On paper, that solves essentially every problem plaguing traditional nuclear construction at once. The problem is that almost nobody on Earth has actually finished one. In the United States, NuScale, the only small modular reactor design certified by American regulators, watched its flagship Idaho project collapse entirely in November of 2023. The projected cost had jumped from $58 per megawatt hour to $89, an increase of more than 50%, and the utilities that were originally supposed to buy that power had only signed up for a small fraction of what the project actually needed to move forward. Read that back for a second. America's single most advanced small modular reactor program could not secure enough paying customers at the new price point, and the entire project died before real construction ever began. In the United Kingdom, Rolls-Royce's small modular reactor design only became the government's officially preferred choice in mid-2025, with actual power generation not expected before the mid-2030s at the earliest. In France, EDF's own compact reactor design, called Nuward, fell so far off track that the company scrapped the original design entirely in 2024 and restarted from scratch, with a working demonstration unit still not expected until sometime in the 2030s. South Korea's compact reactor design, called the SMR, is not expected to reach formal design approval until 2028, with commercial operation targeted somewhere around 2035. Russia already operates floating reactors at sea, but has nothing built on land that matches what China is finishing right now on Hainan Island. Here is the part almost everyone outside the industry misses entirely. The small factory-built reactor concept itself is not a Chinese invention. Western companies pitched this exact idea first, years before China seriously committed to it. What China actually did differently was simply finish one. So let's rewind, because the company's story behind this reactor explains almost everything that follows. The design behind Linglong is called the ACP-100, developed by the China National Nuclear Corporation, one of the two enormous state-owned giants running China's entire nuclear industry. Work on this specific design started quietly around 2010 inside the Nuclear Power Institute of China. By 2014, the preliminary engineering design was already complete. In 2016, the ACP-100 became the first small modular reactor design anywhere in the world to pass the International Atomic Energy Agency's Generic Reactor Safety Review. That detail matters enormously, because it means China's design cleared a genuinely rigorous international technical bar years before a single shovel ever touched the ground at the actual construction site. This was never a rushed announcement timed for a headline. It was roughly a decade of careful engineering work happening quietly before almost anyone outside the nuclear industry ever noticed it was underway. Here is why the underlying engineering itself was genuinely difficult to pull off. In a conventional nuclear reactor, the pressure vessel, the steam generators, and the main coolant pumps all sit apart from each other, connected by large external pipes running between them. Those external pipes are exactly where the worst kind of accidents tend to happen, because if one of them ruptures, coolant can drain away faster than backup safety systems are able to respond. The ACP-100 does something structurally different. It folds the pressure vessel, the steam generators, and the coolant pumps into a single sealed module, which means there is no large external loop left in the design that could rupture in the first place. That single engineering decision is why the China National Nuclear Corporation claims this design does not require the same large off-site emergency planning zone a traditional plant needs, and why it can potentially be sited much closer to cities and industrial parks than older reactor designs ever could safely manage. So what does folding everything into one sealed module actually buy you beyond a smaller footprint? It removes an entire category of failure mode that has historically driven both the safety concerns and the emergency planning costs baked into every conventional reactor design built over the last 50 years. There is also a fuel and supply chain piece to this story that almost never makes it into the more excited headlines. The ACP-100 runs on a 2-year refueling cycle rather than the roughly 12 to 18-month cycle typical of larger conventional reactors, which translates into fewer shutdowns, fewer fuel shipments, and a noticeably simpler maintenance schedule across its planned 60-year operational lifespan. None of that works though. Without a domestic uranium enrichment and fuel fabrication industry capable of reliably supplying it, something China has spent decades quietly building alongside its broader reactor fleet. That is the quiet advantage sitting underneath the more visible one everyone talks about. It is not simply that the China National Nuclear Corporation can pour concrete unusually fast. It is that the entire fuel pipeline feeding the reactor is already built, tested, and running at real industrial scale. The same way a car company genuinely needs an entire battery supply chain firmly in place before it can actually start shipping electric vehicles at volume. Then, in June of 2021, China's National Development and Reform Commission formally approved the demonstration project. 1 month later, on July 13th of 2021, workers poured the first concrete at Changjiang, on Hainan Island, directly alongside reactors that were already operating and others that were already under construction nearby. This is exactly where the story stops sounding like an academic design study and starts looking like a genuine factory production schedule. February 2024, the outer containment dome goes up. May 2024, the control room gets commissioned. April 2025, the main coolant pump gets installed. October 2025, the reactor passes a full cold functional test, essentially a complete system rehearsal run without any actual nuclear fuel loaded. December 2025, it passes a non-nuclear steam and turbine test. The China National Nuclear Corporation has targeted the first half of 2026 for full commercial operation, though independent tracking through the International Atomic Energy Agency's own public database has not yet confirmed first criticality or an actual grid connection as of this recording. Let's be precise about where things actually stand. This reactor has not switched on yet, but it has cleared nearly every technical hurdle standing between initial construction and eventual startup, faster than any comparable Western project has managed at any point in the last 2 decades. Here is a single number that should genuinely stop you for a moment. China's average build time for a nuclear reactor, measured from first concrete poured to actual grid connection, was 6.3 years between 2015 and 2024. The global average outside China sits closer to 9.4 years across that same window. China's single fastest completed build came in at just 4.1 years, start to finish. That gap did not happen by accident. And it is not really about any single reactor design being cleverer than another. So what actually explains a gap that large? It's standardization, plain and simple. A state-owned company building reactor after reactor using the same underlying design, the same suppliers, and largely the same trained crews getting measurably faster and more efficient with every single repetition, the exact same way an automotive factory gets faster and cheaper with every additional 1,000 vehicles rolling off the same production line. China currently operates somewhere between 58 and 63 nuclear reactors. According to the World Nuclear Association, as of September 2025, it had 37 more reactors actively under construction, representing close to 43 gigawatts of new generating capacity. More than the rest of the world combined is currently building at once. The International Energy Agency's 2026 Global Energy Review puts this bluntly, stating that roughly half of all nuclear generating capacity currently under construction anywhere on the planet is being built inside China alone. China's own stated national target is somewhere around 200 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2035. Sometime in 2022, without much international fanfare at all, China quietly passed France to become the world's second largest nuclear power generator, trailing only the United States. This is not really a story about one reactor design beating another reactor design in a head-to-head engineering contest. This is a story about an entire industrial production system beating a traditional, project-by-project construction industry at its own game. Every single reactor the China National Nuclear Corporation finishes teaches the next construction crew how to move even faster on the following one. Western reactors, by sharp contrast, tend to get built almost completely from scratch every single time, with brand new contractors, fresh permitting fights, and entirely new cost estimates generated from zero on nearly every individual project. Now step back for a moment, because none of this exists inside a vacuum, disconnected from the rest of the global energy picture. China is not building this many reactors purely to chase an impressive headline. It is building them because electricity demand is rising sharply. Driven by the exact same underlying forces every advanced economy on Earth is currently facing simultaneously: electrified transportation, industrial automation, and a rapidly growing wave of AI data centers consuming power at a scale most existing power grids were simply never designed to handle. Nuclear remains one of the only major carbon-free energy sources that does not care whether the wind happens to be blowing that particular afternoon. Linglong represents the supply-side answer to that pressure. A reactor small enough to slot into places a full-sized gigawatt-scale plant could never realistically fit, close to industrial parks and coastal cities. Potentially even paired directly with desalination facilities on islands that have no room or existing grid capacity for anything larger. The China National Nuclear Corporation's own published figures claim a single unit running for one full year would offset roughly 880,000 tons of carbon dioxide. A number that sounds fairly abstract until you compare it directly to the carbon absorbed by planting several million trees every single year. Here is the actual problem everyone else racing to catch up is genuinely struggling with. It is not that Western engineers are somehow incapable of designing a good compact reactor. NuScale's design is fully certified by American regulators. Rolls-Royce has real government backing behind its program. EDF's Nuward program employs some of Europe's most experienced nuclear engineers working on it right now. The actual problem is finishing one at a price real customers will commit to, on a timeline that does not collapse under the weight of its own cost overruns somewhere along the way. NuScale's flagship project did not die because the underlying reactor physics failed in any way. It died because the price moved upward, and the customers who were supposed to buy the power simply walked away instead. Nuward was not reset from scratch because the physics failed either. It was reset because the original design could not hit a cost target its future customers actually needed to see on paper before committing real money. Read that back one more time. because it is genuinely the whole point of this entire comparison. The West does not have a small reactor physics problem sitting at the core of this story. It has a small reactor industrial delivery problem, and that particular kind of problem is a much harder thing to fix with a cleverer blueprint alone. This is exactly where France enters the story directly, because France is not some detached outside observer commenting from a distance. It built its entire national economy around nuclear power for roughly half a century, and genuinely has some of the most experienced reactor engineers anywhere on Earth working inside its own nuclear industry. In the summer of 2026, at one of France's largest annual economic gatherings, the chief executive of F described personally watching Chinese construction crews complete a specific piece of reactor infrastructure in about a week. The exact same kind of work that routinely takes up to 2 years back home in France. He was not panicking on stage in front of that audience. He was careful to frame it by saying that working alongside Chinese contractors does not automatically mean French industry becomes dependent on them going forward. But think carefully about what that single admission actually means coming from that specific person. France's own flagship nuclear champion is publicly acknowledging a construction speed gap measured not in weeks, but in years, on the exact category of work needed to build the next generation of reactors anywhere in the world. That is not fear dressed up as polite industry commentary. That is a genuine competitor quietly admitting the other side finishes certain categories of work roughly 100 times faster than they currently can. That sounds on the surface like a narrow construction detail. It genuinely is not. It is a warning about who actually gets to build the next generation of power plants everywhere on the planet going forward. And France is far from the only boardroom paying close attention to this. Every Western utility currently weighing whether to bet billions of dollars on its own compact reactor program is watching the exact same construction photographs coming out of Hainan Island. If a state-backed competitor can reach commercial operation years ahead of a comparable Western schedule, that fundamentally changes the calculation for private investors and public utilities alike, deciding whether a small modular reactor program is even worth the financial risk right now, or whether it is smarter to simply wait and see which design ultimately wins the broader race to real scale. First, hesitation carries a real cost here too, though. Every year a Western program spends reapproving a design internally or renegotiating a price with skittish future customers is another year China's construction crews spend getting measurably faster and building out the supply chain, the trained workforce, and the export case for doing the exact same thing somewhere else entirely. Now here's the genuine plot twist in this story, because it would be far too easy to simply walk away from all of this thinking China has already won the global nuclear race outright. It has not. Not yet at least, and here is exactly why. Building one successful demonstration reactor at home is a fundamentally different achievement from successfully selling an entire fleet of them abroad to other countries. China's actual flagship nuclear export product is a much larger gigawatt-scale design called Hualong 1, not the compact ACP 100 behind Linglong at all. Even that larger, more established export design has only been fully completed overseas in exactly one country so far, Pakistan, where 2 full reactor units were financed roughly 82% through Chinese loans. A similar project in Argentina has repeatedly stalled over ongoing financing and fuel supply disputes between the two governments. A planned project in the United Kingdom stalled entirely amid rising political tension between London and Beijing. As for the specific compact design behind Linglong 1 itself, there is currently no confirmed production line actively building a second or third unit for export anywhere yet. China has not yet proven it can turn one single finished demonstration reactor into a genuinely repeatable export product that other countries will confidently buy, finance, and depend on for a full 60-year operational lifespan. And here is the honest trade-off buried underneath all of these genuinely impressive headline numbers. Small modular reactors everywhere on Earth, including inside China itself, still have not proven their underlying economics actually work at real, meaningful scale. Independent reviews of small modular reactor designs generally find they do not automatically deliver dramatically lower costs per unit of power compared to traditional large-scale reactors. The entire cost argument driving enthusiasm for this technology depends on the exact same learning curve that made Chinese solar panels and electric vehicle batteries so much cheaper over the past decade. Build enough standardized units, and the price per unit keeps falling with each additional one produced. That only actually works though if you genuinely go on to build a large number of them consistently over time. One single finished demonstration reactor does not yet prove that particular cost curve genuinely exists. Not in China, and not anywhere else on Earth either. The hard part was never really building the very first one successfully. The hard part is building the 10th one for meaningfully less money than the first one originally cost to construct. So what actually changes across the world if this design works and China successfully proves it can repeat the entire process reliably at scale? Picture islands and smaller coastal cities that could never realistically justify a full gigawatt-scale reactor suddenly gaining access to steady carbon-free power around the clock. Picture industrial parks pairing a compact reactor directly with a factory that needs constant, reliable heat instead of running continuously on imported fossil fuel. Picture desalination plants finally getting a genuinely stable power source that does not depend on whatever the price of natural gas happens to be that particular week. And picture the exact kind of demand actively pulling all of this forward right now. AI data centers desperately searching for reliable, round-the-clock electricity. Looking closely at a technology that can potentially be built directly next to them, rather than requiring years of new transmission line construction to reach a distant traditional plant. A data center operator today essentially has to choose between waiting a full decade for a traditional gigawatt-scale plant or simply running indefinitely on natural gas instead. A reactor that can realistically be built in just a few years right next door, occupying a fraction of the physical footprint, changes that underlying math almost completely. And if this specific design eventually gets exported and repeated the same way Chinese solar panels and electric vehicle batteries already were, other countries could end up buying not just a single physical reactor, but the entire fuel, maintenance, and long-term servicing relationship that comes bundled along with it for the full 60-year life of the plant. That is precisely the same underlying pattern you have already watched play out clearly in electric vehicles and batteries over the last several years. The price gets cheaper and the long-term dependency gets meaningfully deeper, both at exactly the same time. Here is what genuinely does not change though, no matter how impressive the construction timeline gets from here forward. Nuclear safety culture does not get faster simply because concrete gets poured faster somewhere else in the world. Licensing outside China still takes years for good, well-established reasons, and regulators across the United States. The United Kingdom and Europe are extremely unlikely to fast-track approval of any foreign reactor design without conducting an exhaustive, fully independent safety review of their own first. Nuclear waste still has to go somewhere safe for literally tens of thousands of years, entirely regardless of how physically compact the original reactor happened to be. And any country genuinely considering a Chinese-built reactor still has to weigh the exact same geopolitical question every single country weighs when importing critical national infrastructure from a rival global power block. What actually happens to fuel supply, software, and long-term technical support decades down the road if the underlying political relationship between the two governments changes significantly in the meantime? A cheaper, faster reactor does not erase a single one of those genuine long-term questions. It simply puts all of those exact questions on the table years sooner than almost anyone in the industry originally expected they would need to be answered. So here is the actual picture once you finally zoom all the way out on this entire story. This was never really a story about 125 megawatt reactors sitting on one island in southern China. It is a story about a country that looked closely at a technology the rest of the world has been confidently promising for well over a decade, decided to treat it like a standardized factory product rather than a one-off custom-engineered mega project, and simply got closer to genuinely finishing one first than anyone else managed to. It is the exact same industrial pattern you have already watched play out repeatedly in electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, and commercial shipbuilding over the past 15 years. Identify the specific bottleneck everyone else remains stuck on, throw a state-backed, vertically coordinated industrial system directly at that bottleneck, and gradually turn a technology that used to take an entire decade into something that starts to resemble an actual production line instead. Every single reactor the China National Nuclear Corporation finishes teaches the next construction crew how to move even faster on the one after it. Every additional gigawatt added to China's domestic grid strengthens the underlying case for eventually exporting this exact same design abroad to other countries. Every year the West spends internally resetting its own compact reactor programs from scratch is simply another year China's construction crews spend getting measurably faster at building theirs instead. That is not really a story about one single dramatic breakthrough happening overnight. That is a story about an entire industrial system being carefully assembled piece by piece, one reactor at a time. If this helped you actually see what is being quietly built behind that single attention-grabbing headline, subscribe. Because the next reactor, and the entire industrial system standing behind it, is already under construction somewhere else right now. But here's the real question genuinely worth sitting with once the video ends. Is a faster, cheaper reactor simply good news for a planet that badly needs significantly more carbon-free power flowing onto the grid as quickly as possible? Or is the real prize actually something considerably bigger than that? Lasting control over who ultimately builds, fuels, and maintains the power plants the rest of the world will end up depending on for the next 60 years of their operational lives? Would you personally want a reactor like this one powering your own city if it genuinely meant cheaper, faster, and more reliable clean energy for everyone? Or does it matter just as much to you exactly who ends up holding the keys to the plant that keeps your own lights on every single night? Let me know what you think in the comments.